So, part two of our journey west of the Mississippi. Did we decide we were talking about the Trans-Mississippi West? I don't think we even
We
used that
didn't know,
term
we
last
didn't
time.
discuss it, but we're back to continue talking about all the different things that we couldn't
The
cover last
American
time.
West.
The
Yes.
American West. I
The
guess,
American
what's
West.
funny is I'm glad that we started as far back as we did last time because it is really important to start far back. But when we had originally conceptualized it, I was thinking in US history sequence terms and was like, oh, we're going to talk post 1865. And then you're like, let's go back to 1803. I'm like, all right. But then it caused like a whole like we have to do two parts now because it's a lot. And like you were saying, unless you're discussing things thematically, this isn't a topic that can be discussed chronologically um within a segment of a class, really.
hmm Well, and it's so closely tied to the story of certain groups of people, right? And we can kind of talk about them during today's episode. That it's you want to give it good time in the classroom. You want to give it good time if you're kind of talking about this with children or whatever at home. I mean, you want to give space to this because it's such a formative thing for the United States, and our conceptualization of what we are as Americans is so wrapped up in the American West. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. It's very much a part of the popular imagination too. And I think when a lot of people imagine the United States, they think of the American West. I think that that tends to be it. I had a professor in undergrad who was from London, and he said that when he came here, when he came to the United States, he just really, really wanted to be an American. So the first thing he did was went and bought cowboy boots. But he taught at University of San Diego, and like nobody's wearing cowboy boots in San Diego, right? And he's like, I had a cowboy hat. He grew a Fu Manchu. He's like, everyone was, looking at me funny. And I'm like, yeah, it's not like that.
Yes, it's like,
But I think it's very much a part of the popular imagination of, what is the United States. And a lot of times the American West, Texas, the Wild West, like that kind of stuff, like that imagery, I think plays into a lot of people's idea of what the United States is. So to be able to get a grasp on it and to discuss all these different moments and groups and the expansion and the time periods, and talk about it as a theme, I think is really important. I'm glad that we were able to do two episodes to kind of tease it out a little bit more.
well, that's a fantastic intro. Let's get started with today's podcast. Hello, and welcome to An Incomplete History.
I'm Hillary.
And I'm Jeff.
We're your hosts for this weekly history podcast.
The American West. Before we get started, though, before we get kind of back to our topic in the American West, how's the weather out there? Hot? I mean, it's July in
very
Mississippi.
toasty. Yeah, it's July in Mississippi, but I've heard that it's not as hot as California. California's been very, very hot the last couple of days, I know, but
It's
then into
been
the coming week, it's going to
disgusting.
be. Yeah, so here, I mean, it's like seasonally disgusting. So it's like expected heat, but it's 88 degrees right now with very low humidity. So I feel like we're doing pretty well. I don't think it's that bad.
Well, it has been pretty miserable here.
It's
As
toasty
far as
and there's a fire, yes?
and there's this ship at the Navy Yards on fire.
Goodness gracious.
And it's funny, we live up next to the zoo, and the wind yesterday when the fire was going on, the wind was blowing directly on shore. So none of the smoke was getting up to us. It was going due west from the shipyards instead of kind of northeast, or due east instead of northeast, which would have hit us. And then last night about midnight, the wind shifted. And suddenly it was this stink of burning rubber and oil. And we, like, everybody in the building woke up because people thought there was a fire or something. And then it's like, oh, it's the ship.
Oh,
And
there is a
then,
fire, but it's
yeah.
just not in the
And
building.
yeah. And you can look out and like see, even right now, I can look out in the back and I can see wisp of smoke coming over from it.
Oh
I
gosh.
mean, they had helicopters like dumping water on it today. I don't know, like, how long this fire is going to burn. I mean,
I heard it was
eventually.
gonna be about a week. It's gonna take about a week for it to simmer
Oh
off or
my
simmer down.
God.
Yeah. So
I
I'm
mean,
sorry
couldn't
for
it?
y'all for the air quality, but also for the people who were injured in the explosion, and that's just really
Oh
it's
yeah.
sad.
Well, I
It's
wonder.
what we
I mean,
needed on
you.
top of the pandemic, you know?
Oh well, yeah. That's when it rains, it pours. But anyway, so the American West Part Two. I know last time we kind of traced out this broad history up through the Civil War and even hinted at things after the Civil War, including what many historians who look at the era call the Indian Wars. And I mean, I'd like to talk a little bit about that word today if we can, but the Indian Wars and then kind of the conclusion of those and Frederick Jackson Turner's famous speech in 1893 when he talks about closing of the frontier. Um, and we were kind of looking towards the last part of the 19th century and then looking to the 20th century because the story of the American West doesn't magically end after Turner says the frontier's closed at all. Um, but I mean, let's talk about that word I use, Indian.
Historically inaccurate, of course.
It is historically inaccurate, right? And it's funny, and this is an exercise I do with my freshmen when I teach the U.S. intro sequence. We talk about this because they look through the syllabus. We, the kind of the first day of the class, we kind of go through the syllabus and they look, and there's always something I have in the syllabus where we talk about the people who were in the Americas before Europeans arrived. And there's an article I have them read that is basically, what do we call these people? And always I have a couple of students who are like, well, Indian is incorrect. And they kind of offer all these other words, Native American, indigenous people. We can even go to really obscure words like autochthonous people. They don't use that word, but some people in academics do. And the article I have them read that is in defense of the word Indian is actually written by someone who is a member of a recognized tribe in the United States. And her point is there is no good word that puts all these people together as one group because they are not one group. There are a varied group, as varied as any groups across Europe or Africa or Asia. Um, and so any word is going to be unsatisfactory. And what they do, what her argument is, much like you have people within the Black community and people within the gay community did this, they take a word that has issues and they kind of own it, right? They kind of take ownership over it and say, this is the word we want to call you. And this is a big difference between US history or history in general and kind of other fields in academia is we're one of the few that actually use this term. And I always have this essay that I have people read because I want to use the term that the people who are closest related to these historical actors I'm talking about in the American West want to be used. I mean,
I
what do you
think that
think?
that's an interesting I think it's an interesting conversation, and, like, I certainly understand using an article like that, but I think you could find just as many people who would say, "Well, we didn't get together and all decide this," right? I mean, I'm sure that there are a
Right.
lot of people who are still very offended by it, and so when I teach, I mean, I try not to use the term Indian just because to me, it's like, it's just wrong, right? I mean, it's like the settlers got here and thought it was Indian. It wasn't. They ended up calling everybody Indians, and then it just like spirals out of control. And while I respect that some people are like, yeah, that's fine, I think just the better way to describe people living here is to say indigenous, but that may be, that may not be helpful either. I mean, The other thing that I try to talk about too is like our borders and how
Hmm.
the modern map of the United States, like it didn't look like that for a really, really long time. Like the map that we see today wasn't really completed until into the 1950s, right? And so when you take away those arbitrary lines really that we've drawn over a certain number of time, like there was a lot of flow. There was, flow between regions, between what we would have as state lines, and there were different tribes and bands and villages and everything of different people. And to consider how varied it was, the languages, the culture, everything. I was just looking at a map of California today and what we call California now, and like looking at how many different native tribes there were just in the state of California alone with their own
Hmm.
unique languages. I mean, it gets complicated to me to just say, oh, they're Indians. That being
Right.
said, it is a way for everybody to understand what you're talking about, right? I mean, in the United
Well,
States,
that's
but I think people in India would be like, what?
right. Well, that's so one of the things this article, this essay she talks about is, and a lot of people who are involved in kind of reworking education from the perspective uh, of a member of a tribe. She says, and they agree with her on this idea of if you know the tribal affiliation of someone, you should use that first before you resort to something kind of some broader term like Indian or American Indian or Native American or even indigenous person. Use their actual tribal designation, tribal affiliation if you know it, barring that you can move to other things. And that's what I try to do in my own work when I know that somebody is a member of a certain group. I try to use that term. If it's unknown, then I might resort to a more general term. But I usually, if it's a specific person and it's unknown, I refer to them by their name actually and kind of put it out there. But, I think this is, and some people might listen to this and think, well, this is a really nitpicky kind of conversation. But I think there's something really important in how we refer to historical actors. And I feel in people who study the Civil War and kind of the antebellum South, the history of slavery in America, this conversation is kind of an ongoing conversation as well, right? As historians, we generally don't like the word slaves anymore
Mm-hmm.
because it flattens the experience of people.
When you say
Um,
enslaved people,
Enslaved peoples or you refer to them by their name or
by their
who they
name, yeah.
are,
Well, and
right?
also there's also a big conversation between people about capitalizing the B in black or not capitalizing it, or things
Right.
like that. I mean, there's a lot of power in words and in the way that we talk about things and the way that we talk about history. And it's a subject, like you said, it maybe sound nitpicky, but it ends up trickling down into the very way that we teach young children. And so words are powerful and important. And to really tease these things out and have these conversations is not just important for historians, but it's important for everybody, particularly in this moment where we're really trying to re examine a lot of what we have been taught as like this, like the knowledge that we've been given and that were the things that we've been taught in school. Like there's a lot of things that are coming into question. And so it's up to people, I think, like us to have these nitpicky conversations to help kind of disseminate a new paradigm, or but inclusively, right? To think about how can we talk about these things and then help everybody get involved in the conversation in a way that they feel comfortable.
Right. Right.
Because that's where I
Well, and
feel weird about it right now. It's like, why do I get to say what people should or shouldn't be called, right? Because every time I've read anything about it, it's like people are like, I want to be referred to by my tribe. It's like, okay.
right.
So to me, if I, like you said, if I know the tribe, I'll say the tribe. But I think saying somebody's name is also really important. But when you're writing an entire dissertation, and often, like in so much of your dissertation, you had to confront this exact issue. I mean, how are you going to discuss huge groups of people who were impacted by, the military in those regions, or whatever
Right.
your chapter was
Well,
about? But it's important to confront.
it's and what I ended up doing a lot of times, even in the stuff I'm writing now, is uh, the word Indian gets used a lot by the government in its programs and policies and initiatives. So when I use that word, it's a signal to the reader that I'm talking about government programs, government policies, those things. And when I switch to a tribal name, it means I'm actually talking about kind of the responses people had to those people who these policies were intended to kind of
It's
affect.
nuance, but it's important. Like, that's a
Yeah.
subtle change, but there's a lot of meaning and thought behind it. And so I guess that's an important point. It's like you have to confront those things in order to write, and then you're subtly kind of shifting the conversation, right? Between,
Well, and it's
government or not, and yeah.
mhm. Well, and what we want to avoid doing is replicating what we look at the government does to people in these spaces across the 19th century and into the 20th century, what they do to them, which is they treat them all as identical.
They
They don't,
homogenize,
they
exactly.
homogenize them, and they
Uh-huh.
don't recognize that there's a variety of cultural experiences and worldviews there. They kind of compress them all.
With different
Um,
interests, and that's what worries me when when I'm confronted with having to use the word Indian or indigenous or native or something. Like,
mhm.
it homogenizes and it lumps everybody into one category. I mean, it's like calling somebody African. Okay, like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult. I mean, I know, but we
Well,
do it
and
with a lot of different groups.
right,
Like European,
and
right? Like, European people are all different too, right?
well, I think it happens less with European people. I think there's a distinction there. There's an awareness that there's a difference between people from region A and region
People make
B.
a little more of an effort. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying
Right.
though, is like,
Right.
we homogenize. I think, like, that's the I don't like going to this level, but like, that's the structure, right? That's the structural inequity, where you're just like homogenize an entire continent, African, or you
Hmm.
homogenize the people in an entire continent, native, Indian, indigenous. But then you'll be like, oh, he's French or
Well, you
something,
might
right?
even get more granular than that. It's like, well, he's from
Parisian.
Marseille. And
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, he's from Paris. That's much
Oh, that
different than
explains
Marseille.
it.
And this is
Yeah.
right. And it's so, but I mean, that's kind of some of the challenges here is, I mean, let's talk about the challenges of studying Western history and creating some kind of cogent story of the American West. And one of the biggest issues is this kind of nomenclature. Like, how do we refer to people? But I think in tandem with that is a lack of indigenous voices
Mhm.
or a supposed lack of indigenous voices. Because one of the things my work I try to do is show there are indigenous voices there. You just have to look a little harder for them.
Well, and they're not archived in the same manner as, like, voices from the federal government or papers or things like that, because the archivist has an incredible amount of power, and what we decide to save or not also plays a huge role in that, where you can
Hmm.
be looking, 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 and it's hard to find stuff because you have centuries of white heteronormative, right, kind of things, where it's just like, well, we're going to record the history of straight white men, or,
Hmm.
because it can go in so many different directions. But it's hard to find stuff, where you're looking for indigenous voices, because of just what's saved. But it's there, and you found a lot of it, right? I mean, so
Hmm.
how you want to talk a
I
little bit about
found
that?
yeah, so it's one really amazing source. The Depression does a lot of terrible things in the United States, but one
Oh,
really good thing it does
yeah.
is the WPA does all these interviews with people, and there's a whole host of problems with how they conduct the interviews, the questions they ask, all of that. I mean, we could devote a multi part series to the problems of it. But what they actually do is they get recordings of people who had experienced things like the Civil War, who had been an enslaved person, who had been an indigenous person that had been sent to an Indian school, who had people who had lived through major events of the 19th century. Their voices were recorded and we got to hear them. And these recordings still exist today. And you can hear them. And there's just something about it to hear these people in their own words talk about their experiences. And it's an amazing collection. And there are indigenous voices there. But what I found was a lot of the people who gave interviews who were indigenous, they the transcripts were kept, but the recordings weren't.
So you can't actually hear the voices.
I can sometimes, but I found there seemed to be a higher percentage of those where the recordings are lost than other groups. And it was kind of sad because you wonder why that is, why those recordings are discarded. Are they really lost or are they like sitting somewhere? Um, but I mean, they're there. So, I can't get the same granular detail I could get with, German immigrants in the
Well, and then you
Dakotas.
do have to wonder though what, like, if the transcription's actually accurate. Do they reflect
Well,
what
that's
was
right.
actually
I mean,
said?
there's,
And you can see episode 5 on conspiracy theories if we want to go there. But you have to
yes.
wonder, right?
Well, yeah, because and that's the whole one of the problems with the WPA and the interview format and everything is there is embedded in the whole process some problems that can lead you to certain questions being stressed and other questions being minimized. Um, and you also sometimes it's infuriating. Some of the recordings I did listen to, I mean, you can follow along of what they were being asked, and the respondent says something really interesting, and then the interviewer doesn't pursue that really interesting point,
Mm-hmm.
and like say, no, like I want to hear more about
Go
this.
back.
Um, well, and this leads us to, kind of back to this what we referred to last time and what the government called the Indian problem. One of the guys that I listened to, excuse me, was he had immigrated from Germany very young, excuse me, and he joined the army when he was old enough to. And he gives this interview, and the reason he wanted to join the army, and this was after 1876. This was after um, uh, Custer had been killed. Um, uh, he said he wanted to join to go kill Indians.
Mm.
And to hear him say that and, you know, suddenly to say something that I had suspected for a group, a certain kind of, because there's an upsurge in these enlistments, for him to say it and the way he said it and the frustration because he found himself in the army and he found himself actually not being put in a situation where he could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So many people, I think, join the military with the idea of what's going to happen, and then it's
yes,
not really,
they
it's
did. I
not
mean,
right.
that's the thing is they did. And what happens is the U.S. military actually, it does have these engagements, military engagements, and very bloody confrontations. But for the most part, the U.S. Army after 1876 is kind of it's something we call a constabulary force,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's basically they're the policemen of places that are still territories, not states,
Mm-hmm.
and um, and that role shifts even more towards the end of the 19th century. And whereas early on their role had been to kind of protect white people as they came out west, the role increasingly, and this is something I touch on in my research, towards the end of the 19th century becomes to, at least in the minds of some of the people in charge, some of the officers in the army, to protect indigenous people from these kind of ruthless
Yeah, from these
land grabbing,
vigilantes. Yeah.
right? Vigilantes, land grabbers, all these people moving in from the east. to protect them from those groups.
That they
And
thought was just this lawless region. Exactly.
yeah, yeah, because it's, it's, there had been told there's nothing, the people living here aren't doing anything with the land.
Yeah,
The land is
nothing to
up for
stop
grabs.
you, and yeah, uh-huh.
But I mean, it's so the West, it's a complicated space, and what it even is a complicated question. Like, what do we mean when we talk about the West? Like, where do we mean?
Well, I think you said in the
It's,
beginning of the episode, like, the Trans-Mississippi West, right? Like, whatever's west of the
okay,
Mississippi
all
River.
right,
But, what I think is an interesting question, though, just kind of building on what you're talking about with the military, and you have such a command over this era, of course, because you're an expert in this era. But I would really like to ask listeners to think, if I asked you to tell me 5 things that happened between 1875 and 1900, what did you learn? What did you learn in school about what happened
very
during this
little.
time? It's very little. It's not covered. And we kind of touched on this a little bit in the last week's podcast about how it ends up being the West, and the discussion of it ends up being kind of a footnote, a paragraph or two, a section of a chapter. And what do you learn about it? I mean, and what do you learn about this era? But really, I mean, it's so important to understand some of the things that are happening with the mass migration of people, and how that's impacting the development of the majority of the United States. What we, today would draw our borders and say, west of the Mississippi, that's a lot of that's a lot of land. That's a lot of space that a lot of people move into. And so to have just like a paragraph or a section of it was really kind of sad, right?
Hmm. Well, and there are so many critical moments, whether the moment has to do with kind of consolidating federal control over this space, whether it has to do with ordering the military's relationship with indigenous people or with the public more broadly speaking. But I mean, there are a couple of dates I want to throw out here. And it's funny because people think historians are obsessed with dates, and we really aren't. Um, because this thing happened on this day. Well, it was the culmination of things that preceded it, and it was
It's more about an
only one
era
of
than a specific date,
right,
right?
right, but 1876, 1876 is a momentous year for the United States. They're celebrating the 100th anniversary, the centennial. They were only 11 years out from the end of the bloody Civil War, right? And they're celebrating this centennial. And there was this big exposition in Philadelphia, and news arrives by July 4th that George Armstrong Custer and elements of the 7th Cavalry had been annihilated at the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Battle of Little Bighorn,
And
1876.
it's the way funding had been going for the Army in the post Civil War era. The Army's funding had been cut and cut and cut and cut and cut. And there was they were trying to deal with what they viewed as the Indian problem. Um, and the Indian problem was basically there were people living in the places white people wanted to live. That's basically what the Indian problem is. What do
That's
you
a
do
great
with those
way to
people?
describe it, right? That's because that's exactly that phrase was used commonly, the Indian
Hmm.
problem. But the
And
problem was, we want to live here and you live here. Yeah.
we want to, but, it, and I don't want to just stop at that definition though, because there were some people who, a problem they identified when they spoke of the Indian problem is they wanted to incorporate these people within the United States
Right. Assimilate through
culturally, and they
assimilation.
want right. Well, they get to assimilation. Initially, it's this, they want to figure out how do you even do this, and eventually they arrive at this idea of assimilating them, that you actually have to fully Americanize them. You have to kind of strip them of their old language, strip them of their old cultural practices, strip them of their old religion, and teach them how to be kind of model middle class white Protestant Americans. And this is why the Indian schools really flourish, is because this is a concerted effort to kind of do this. And so this kind of question of the Indian problem and what was going to happen, and the military funding had been going down, and then this battle of like Little Bighorn happens, and it's kind of a wake up call in the army, and they decide they really have to deal with this. And the funny thing is, I mean, it's not funny, haha, is by the time the US military kind of gears up its engine to militarily confront many groups of people who are kind of acting outside the bounds of the US government, um, it's almost completely taken care of, because kind of the other, and there's more that goes on here than this, but the other kind of big moment, I would say, as far as military confrontation, um, is Wounded Knee.
Mhm.
And, Wounded Knee happens December 1890 into January of 1891. And Wounded Knee was, it was the culmination, I think, in many ways, of the way Western Europeans militarily brutalized indigenous people, and then tried to couch it in the language of, well, they had guns or something like that. I mean, how does that sound?
But also, I mean, so you jump like 1876 for the Battle of Little Bighorn, and then you go to Wounded Knee. You're talking like over a decade difference, right? Almost 2 decades at that point. But it's interesting that you said it was like practically resolved at this time. And one of the major things that ends up happening, and it's just a product of time passing, and we talked a little bit about this during the first part, is the decimation of buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
The Sioux and the Cheyenne warriors who were led, in the Battle of Little Bighorn, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, they're defending their tribal land. They win this major battle. Um, Over 250 men die, of course, at that battle. And they're in defense of their land, and it's in the Dakota Territory. But eventually, they have to give up this land anyway because of the decimation of their food source. And so
Right.
there's almost this natural culmination of events where it kind of doesn't end with a major battle or a major spark. It's like people are starved out of their homelands. They're forced to relocate. They're forced to give up their land because they're moving and looking for food sources. And kind of going into, I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole again, but we were talking about genocide last week, and like, this is one of those things for me that qualifies as a genocide. And I don't, want to like measure it up to the Holocaust, because I don't really want to do that. I don't think that that's useful comparison. But if you're thinking about like whole group of people being targeted by something, by a policy, or killing all these buffalo, killing off their food sources, I mean, millions of people end up dying as a result of that. And so there isn't a major like moment where it's like boom, all of the Indian land is gone now, and everybody has been pushed off or forced out. It's a slow burn, and it's a slow
Mm-hmm.
burn that culminates perhaps toward the end of the 19th century, but which starts centuries prior with the arrival of European immigrants, and the arrival of disease, and the arrival of technology, and the arrival of people who are hungry for land and money and space and all that. I mean, it's a really slow burn where there's a die off of people who are being pushed from lands, food sources are being decimated or contaminated, disease is ravaging all these people. Um, and so by the end of the 19th century, it's like it's kind of petering out at this point after taking decades and centuries. And so that's another reason why a discussion of the West is difficult, because it's a really complicated series of events that leads to the eventual outright takeover of the entire space. That West, European settlers end up just taking over the whole region.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because Yes, I jumped. There's a big time difference between kind of Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee, but one reason I do it is that from 1876 to 1890-91, it is more than a decade's worth of time, but all of the imagined confrontations between the US Army out in these wooden stockaded forts versus restless Indians plaguing travelers and all of these things, all the real history of that, all the real moment that that happens is in that is happens between those two events. That is when the conflict gets its kind of hottest.
I think too, though, a really important point of time right between those two moments is the Dawes Act,
Well, that's next
1887.
in my notes, right?
Okay,
It's like
yeah.
it's like this. So there's not just a military action going on, and military action. It's one way to look at this, but there is this whole kind of administrative action that's going on, and the Dawes Act in 1887. If you step back and look at it, and you don't know what ends up being done with it, it actually sounds like it might help the individual members of these tribes, right?
Eh, maybe,
If
but
you if you don't know what's going to be done with it and you
yeah.
don't kind of know the double talk that's in it, it kind of seems like, well, this is going to guarantee they can't lose their land. And it basically it's what the Dawes Act promises is that each head of household to get 160 acres. And if you're not a head of household, but you're over 18 years of age, you get 80 acres. And basically what you have to do is you have to separate from your tribal organization. You have to
And
Americanize,
this is
basically.
a forced Americanization attempt, right?
Right, right. And, it's the Americanized part that's the big problem, right? But there is a problem with the land. The idea of individually owned land is so different than the way many of these groups conceptualized ownership.
Yeah, it's asking people to really deny not just their culture and not just their language and their dress and their customs and their religion and everything, but it's asking them to deny their literal worldview. And
Mhm.
some people accepted and some didn't. But the government comes in and makes 2 million acres of Indian land available in Oklahoma. And this is really relevant right now, right? Because the latest Supreme Court case, one of the latest Supreme Court cases, gave that land back,
Yep.
right? I mean, this is like we didn't intend for this to happen, but like this is a really pertinent issue right at this moment where it's almost overturning part of that the Dawes Act of 1887. But what happens when the government makes this 2 million acres of Indian land available in Oklahoma? This brings tens of thousands of white settlers. Um,
Upwards of 100,000.
yeah, and the Indians lost 86 million of the 138 million acres of land in their hold
Hmm.
in 1877. So the US acquired 1.5 billion acres of land from Native Americans, an area 25 times the size of Great Britain, just said, boom, this is ours now. You can have some of it if you're willing to act in this way, if you're willing to dress in this way, if you're willing to speak this language, if you're willing to attend our schools, if you're willing to deny your culture, religion, everything else, you can have some land.
But not really.
But not really.
I mean, so when I teach this, when I teach kind of the experience of people who did actually go to the Indian schools, who did do everything according to the Dawes Act's rules, we talk about how it became a moving target that they were never actually allowed to reach. That
Because
they
it's
were being,
always about broken treaties and broken promises. This goes
well,
all the way back, right? It's always about breaking promises.
but they were being trained in the Indian schools to do jobs that there was no way they were going to get hired for. They were being trained to take on what were viewed as traditionally white middle class jobs. They weren't going to get those jobs. Somebody was going to take one look at them and say, nope, don't want that person.
Even if they
And
had Americanized or dressed a particular
it
way,
doesn't,
right?
right, it didn't matter. It did not matter. And um this is the legacy. I mean, this so I would say this. I think the military kind of the final defeat at Wounded Knee, combined with the Dawes Act, combined with this kind of betrayal of Oklahoma or Indian Territory, which was supposed to be theirs in perpetuity. Remember, we talked about that last time about when Jackson engineered the removal. This land in Oklahoma was supposed to be theirs forever.
Forever, right. And
And
that was
suddenly
somehow
forever
supposed to
became
make up for pushing them away from where they had known Alabama, Georgia, these areas.
right. But I
Oklahoma
mean,
was somehow gonna make up for that, but even Oklahoma got taken.
you combine all of these things together, and it's the legacy of that for indigenous people through the 20th century becomes one of constantly fighting against kind of popular representation, the popular history that's created about the American West, where Indians are kind of homogenized and they're all wearing headdresses and they're all kind of bare chested on horses, setting covered wagons on fire. All of this, you know, they're not allowed to kind of narrate their own past. They're
Mhm.
forced to kind of constantly be at odds with a narrative that's put on them, because one of the biggest kind of themes that crops up in American film, which becomes a huge kind of unifying cultural phenomenon, are Westerns, right? Where they mythologize this past, this confrontation with Indians, this Indian problem. And it really is viewed as uh, white guys going out and shooting Indians is really viewed as a manly American thing.
Well, and playing cowboys versus Indians, right? Saying,
Mm-hmm.
there's, and that's like Leave It to Beaver style kind of stuff, right? The 1950s, you get this romanticization of the American West, and you start seeing all these films in the 1950s and 1960s, and John Wayne. Um, but cowboys were also romanticized as being the opposite of an Indian, but cowboys didn't live a particularly romantic life. That's interesting to me too. I'll often cover that where it's like, a lot of people who were doing cattle drives were black men,
Mm-hmm.
Mexican men, poor white men. They're these symbols of like life and freedom on the open range, but there's really nothing romantic about them. They're really low paid wage workers. Um, they're, going from place to place. They're not well fed. They're not going around and just shooting Indians. I mean, and that's what's so interesting about there's this, binary of like, are you a cowboy or an Indian in the West? And they're at odds with one another. But like, that's just a totally wrong depiction of what's going on. Is that fair?
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, they're not. I mean, if you want to have the Indians battling somebody, it would be U.S. Army
It would
soldiers,
be the army. Yeah, it wouldn't be.
right?
And settlers. I mean, actually
And
settlers.
settlers, and vigilante, drunken groups of vigilante settlers.
Yeah. But it's not
Um,
cowboys because cowboys had an actual job and it
right,
wasn't
and
out fighting Indian people.
right, and cowboys. You're talking about just a handful of people traveling together with large herds of cattle, right?
Yeah, they're on a
Moving
cattle
them.
drive, which stops. Cattle drives
It's
stopped by the late 19th century because people privatize land and fence it. So you
plus
can't
you have
just take
Chicago.
yeah, you can't take cattle all the way across the open range anymore because it's not open anymore. People have grabbed the land and fenced the land. Yeah, and then
Well, when
Chicago.
you right, right. Well, when you had only one transcontinental rail line, you had to drive cattle to the rail line. But as we get more and more rail lines and connector lines, you don't need to drive them all across the Great Plains. You only have to drive them to the closest rail line. And so the need for them decreases. um I mean, it's interesting you mentioned them, because the next place I wanted to go, and I want to make sure we get to this before we run out of time, is the American West is so critically important for the history of labor in the United States.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it. I would say the most important thing the American West does in the 20th century is it helps determine labor relations. And it's really a contest between how much power and authority the federal government has over both states and municipalities and the individual. And, you know, we get these major labor uprisings at the end of the 19th century. Pullman dispute. You've got the Coxyites who are marching and going to go to Washington. Um, but at the same time, um, you get the emergence of labor unions based in mining and other kind of fields.
That's the thing. The professions shift dramatically. What people are mostly employed doing is very different than that of the Northeast, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you've got mining, you've got railroads, and mining in a lot of different ways. Copper mines, very different from, say, a coal mine out in Virginia or something like that, right? Like the labor shifts, and the people who are performing the labor also, the demographic shifts. And you start seeing the emergence of different types of labor unions in this time period. And you see immigration coming from a different direction, right? We see immigrants coming from China, male laborers coming from China to work in the railroads and to work in mining and such, coming to California and then kind of dispersing across the American Southwest. And labor does start to take a different shape. It looks different, and the required labor is different. And then the emergence of these labor unions is fueled by the different types of labor being performed in the West. This, just day to day life just starts to look different.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you also have a large push of immigration from South Asia as well, right?
Yes.
So you get so coming from the east, you get kind of this huge upswing of immigration from Ireland, from Germany, even from places like France and Scandinavia and England coming in, and you get huge populations from Northern Europe who are moving into kind of the northern Great Plains. But on the opposite side of the Rockies, coming from the Pacific coast, you get Chinese laborers are brought in to work in California initially. Then they do things like help build the transcontinental railroads, but also are indispensable when it comes to mining activities. You get South Asian immigrants who come in. And when I talk about immigrants, I'm talking almost universally male.
Yes, it's not until the very late 19th century that you start seeing families
Right,
immigrating. It's
right.
predominantly all the way up until the late 19th century, it's predominantly single men who are coming. And that creates a
Yes.
whole different
Well,
atmosphere,
I mean,
right, in a
that's
lot of these Western towns. They're just male-dominated spaces.
right. So you get, and there's a famous piece that's written, a monograph that kind of argues that virtually every woman in a frontier town would at some time in her life engage in sexual labor.
I don't like that.
She'd be a sex worker. I disagree with it. I disagree with it completely. My research shows they actually, when a woman was a sex worker, it's actually noted that
And
she
there
was.
were a lot of women who were sex workers.
Oh
There
yeah,
were,
but
not
it was not
every
the
woman in the
majority.
West was a sex worker.
Right,
Nothing against
right.
sex workers.
But but you do end up with these towns. One of the little ones I look at in Montana for a long time, its male female ratio was like 75 to 1.
So what's happening in those towns?
Well,
There's
I
just
don't
no sex
know.
happening?
There's obviously sex happening, and that's like a whole different conversation. That's the history of sex, which is a different thing. But I
We can
mean,
go there at some point because
well,
a
the
lot of
funny thing
interesting
is
things to talk about.
right. I mean, the funny thing is of these towns, though, they generally don't have these disparities, these kind of stark ratios between men and women for very long, especially if they're designed to be a sustainable town. I mean, that's one of the things you get the town fathers. One of the things they push for is getting women in and
Yeah,
getting families in,
and
because
having
that
large
leads to
families.
right, and that leads to stability. Um, you know what? I think we need to devote an episode to Chinese workers in the American West
Yeah.
and what that entailed. I think we need a whole episode where we really talk about that, because there's just not. I mean, we're getting near the end of today, and we've just barely touched on this. I mean, it's a fascinating topic. Um, it is as fraught with tragedy as the story of indigenous people and
Mhm.
the kind of confrontation with the federal government. Um, and again, this goes back to the conversation we had last time, that sometimes our students are like, we just talk about all these terrible things we did. Well, that's we did a lot of terrible things.
It's a lot to cover. There's a lot to
I,
cover.
and kind of where I want to kind of end today is I do I do want to at least give a little clarity on the Battle of Wounded Knee, or the Massacre at
Yeah.
Wounded Knee,
Yeah, yeah.
because I think it's important for people to understand exactly what happens there. Um, this is December 1890. This is in the Great Plains, northern Great Plains. It's bitterly cold up there. If you've ever traveled to the Dakotas in December, you'll know what I mean. The wind comes whipping down the Rockies and is bitingly cold. And really, the U.S. Army had been rounding up groups of Indians who refused to remain on reservations. And um, a group of Lakota Sioux had been followers of the Ghost Dance movement. The Ghost Dance movement had been broken up. Again, something we really didn't get to talk about much. But they had been kind of sequestered in this one place and were being moved. And Sitting Bull had been killed. He was a prominent leader just the month before, or a few weeks before, actually. And the 7th Cavalry, and it's not a coincidence that it's the 7th Cavalry. This is the same unit that had been massacred in 1876 at Little Bighorn, are pursuing them. And eventually they get these people to surrender at Wounded Knee Creek. And an encampment is set up there while they kind of decide what they're going to do. So 106 men were separated from 250 women and children, and and this was on December 28th, and on the 29th, that morning, they go around to forcibly collect weapons from these men. And what happens next is unclear, but there seems to have been some kind of dispute over the surrender of a firearm. Now remember, these rifles aren't just used for war, they're also used to shoot buffalo, to shoot other game, to survive. Um, but some kind of dispute happens, a shot is fired, and kind of chaos breaks out. Now, the US Army has a technological advantage here because, first of all, most of the 106 men had been disarmed already. Second of all, the US Army had Hotchkiss guns, which are kind of primitive level machine guns. And these Hotchkiss guns open fire. And 300 people are killed in this confrontation. 300 Lakota Sioux. Now you notice, as 106 of the men were identified as warriors, that means almost 200 people of those killed were not, in fact, identified as warriors. These are civilian casualties. Um, and the effect is kind of profound in some groups. Pictures go back to the East and people kind of see this. People are embarrassed by it, people are horrified by it. Um, there are kind of initial claims that we're going to change what we do, that we need to change this, but nothing ever comes of that. There's kind of a wringing of hands at the tragedy, but no real move to fix the problem. And it's a really depressing end to the story of the federal takeover of the Great Plains. Correct?
Gosh, I was on mute again. I'm so mad at myself. I was saying it's like the late 19th century version of thoughts and prayers,
Yeah.
right? Like
I
it
mean,
was it
people,
was a wringing of hands and it was a, oh, we're so upset about it. But nothing really happens. But it does kind of stop the mass conflicts that were occurring, right? I mean, but
because I think it scares the crap out of people and they realize
yeah,
this crazy government will take machine guns and shoot us.
yeah. Well, and
And we have
what's
no
yeah,
chance.
yeah, what's crazy too, I mean, and I was on mute this entire time. What's crazy too is you're talking non-combatants. People who are not a
Elderly
threat.
women,
Elder
young
Yeah,
children.
and I you have the narrative from the army where it's like, "Well, we don't really know what happened. A shot went off." Okay, yeah, a shot went off, but then you massacred hundreds of people, non-combatants? Like, you took well, first of all, yeah, you disarmed them, took away their livelihood, they're hunting, using these weapons to hunt and everything, but it is a really depressing moment because it's one of those moments where you go, "Wow, that was, just undeniably screwed up thing that happened," right? And to me,
Well,
it's like there's no defense of it. There's no defense.
to
You can
add,
just say, "Oh, if a shot went off," like a shot went off, and so you massacred everyone sitting there?
to add insult to injury, 18 US soldiers get the Medal of Honor.
Ugh. I wouldn't want that Medal of Honor. I'd be so embarrassed. I would be
I mean,
so embarrassed. I mean, you read about things like this happening during the Second World War, right? Where there are
mhm.
just innocent people lined up and shot, right? Like the Einsatzgruppen going around and just murdering innocent people. And like, it's horrifying. It's horrifying when you read stuff like this. But again, I ask you to go back and think 1875 to 1900. What did you know about this? Did you
Mhm.
realize that it was such an egregious act on behalf of our military? Do we realize that it was
Well,
non-combatants? Do we realize that the people who were massacred were unarmed? I don't think so. I mean, we gloss over this kind of stuff.
I think it's an uncomfortable period for what the government is doing in general because
I think every
whereas
period is an uncomfortable period for what the
kind
government
of
is doing in
kind of,
general.
but I think it's more uncomfortable here because the actions are directed against civilians, the actions are directed against the you also get kind of US soldiers firing on labor protesters during the same period.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you start to see the and this is we can talk so much about this, and this is, like, bleeds into my work. It's like militarization and you're saying like these constable forces, right, where you have
Mhm.
people going in who are like law enforcement of types, whether federal, state, local, whatever. You see the mass buildup of these forces of people who have been given authority, and in the West where things are like lawless, and I mean, I'm thinking, like Tombstone or something, you have people coming in who are just like, "I'm in charge now, I have the gun," and you start
Mhm.
seeing a huge buildup of police forces, law enforcement forces who aren't who kind of crop up out of their own lawlessness. And you do
Mhm.
see that there's no professionalism involved in it, really. It's more like who has more guns, and then who's going to be deemed as the person who is in charge, who is going to be granted the authority to take charge of a situation. And it's very uncomfortable when you look at it this moment, and you see the people who were hired to put down labor strikes. They were going into the jails, to the local jails, and deputizing people in local jails to go put down the coal strikes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've always said, and like, I don't know, I'm giving away, like, I guess my second book idea, but it's just like there's a really fine line between cop and criminal. really fine line. And we see that now, of course. It's true. My parents are
No,
police.
I
I know,
agree. I
like, and I'm not
agree.
saying my parents are criminals, but like this is just something you can see going back really, really far, where there's something psychological going on, where there's like this really fine line that people teeter on. And it's uncomfortable in the late 19th century because we really start seeing it come into fruition when all of these little law enforcement agency kind of things start cropping up at this moment. And it's to put down unrest, it's to stop native people from having their land, it's to stop laborers from striking over unfair or bad working conditions and all that. And of course we move into the progressive era where we try to kind of correct some of that, but the police forces continue to grow and continue to become more powerful. And that's a super exciting topic for me, but
Yeah.
I think
It's
that
a
that's
great it's a great way to end the episode today because I think it points us in some interesting directions.
I'm really sad
Yeah,
we didn't talk about Mormons again, Jeff.
there's so much we didn't talk
So
about.
much.
We might have to have a religion in America,
I
couple
Can
of
we just
episodes
do
about religion in
Mormons?
America.
I always have like I have like 3 pages right here on Mormons. I think this is all right. Anyway, I'm always very excited by
Anyway,
talking about Mormons and the West, right? Because like there's so much space that Mormon people occupy in these regions still that's kind of like uncharted territory. Anyway, that's a good
yeah,
place to end.
yeah. Well, fantastic. Great conversation about the American West.
Thanks, Jeff.
Um, yeah, thanks, Hillary. Please join us next time on An Incomplete History.